Welcome to Cabin of Horrors, the podcast where we unearth the darkest corners of history, mythology, and film to uncover the roots of fear itself. Tonight, we're traveling back, and I mean way back, to where horror first began. Before Dracula, before Lovecraft, before even the ancient ghosts of Japan, there was Mesopotamian mythology, a land of terrifying gods, monstrous guardians, and a bleak, inescapable underworld. Tonight, we dig into both the Epic of Gilgamesh along with the fears of the Mesopotamians, the monstrous specters of the ancient world, the fear of death, the unknown, things lurking in the darkness, and how these early horrors shaped everything from modern horror films to demonic possessions. When we think about the origins of horror, our minds often jump to Gothic castles, fog-drenched moors, or the cosmic nightmares of H.P. Lovecraft. But horror's true roots stretch much further back, all the way to the first recorded civilization, Mesopotamia. The people of Mesopotamia lived in the lands of modern-day Iraq, Iran, Syria, and Turkey. They built towering ziggurats and wrote some of the earliest known texts. But they also lived in constant fear of their gods, fear of spirits lurking in the shadows, and of the eternal nightmare that awaited them after death. The Mesopotamians didn't have the concept of a comforting afterlife. There wasn't pearly gates, no golden streets. Instead, they feared Kor, the underworld, a vast, desolate wasteland where souls wandered in eternal gloom, feeding on dust and clay. Theirs was a world where death was the ultimate horror, inescapable and bleak, and that fear seeped into every story they ever told. Now imagine a time over 4,000 years ago, before Rome, before the Great Pyramids of Egypt, before written history as we know it. In the city of Uruk, a mighty king ruled with an iron grip. His name was Gilgamesh, and he was no ordinary man. He was 2/3 god, 1/3 human, a demigod among mortals. His mother was the goddess Ninsun, his father a mere king. Gilgamesh possessed immense strength and wisdom, but as great as he was also cruel. His people feared him, his desires remained unchecked, and his rule was unchallenged. But the gods were watching, and they had a plan. To restore balance, the gods created Enkidu, a wild man covered in hair, living among beasts. He knew nothing of civilization, nothing of war, nothing of kings. But that was about to change. When Enkidu was tamed by the temple priestess Shamat, he became more man than beast. And when he entered Uruk, he challenged Gilgamesh to a battle that shook the very foundations of the city. The two fought, the streets trembled under their strength, but in the end, neither could claim victory. They were equals. And in that moment, something strange happened. They became brothers, not by blood, but by bond. And together, they set out on a journey that would become legend. Some might argue that the oldest known work of horror fiction is actually the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, Gilgamesh is often talked about as an adventure, a hero's journey. But when you look closer, it's filled with the themes that define horror today. Mortality, the fear of the unknown, and the monstrous forces lurking just beyond the edges of civilization. At the heart of this ancient tale is Humbaba, the guardian of the cedar forest. Humbaba wasn't just any monster, described as having a face made of intestines and a roar that could shake the mountains. He was a being of pure, primal terror. Gilgamesh and his companion Enkidu ventured into the forest to slay him, but they do so knowing that they're provoking something ancient and powerful. Now, if this sounds familiar, it probably is because it is. This whole setup mirrors modern horror films where foolish heroes venture into places they shouldn't. Think movies like The Evil Dead or The Blair Witch Project. And what happens when they finally kill Humbaba? Well, his dying breath becomes a curse, a foreshadowing of doom. And sure enough, Enkidu soon falls gravely ill and dies, sending Gilgamesh spiraling into an existential crisis. The idea of vengeance from beyond the grave, of monsters that don't just die, but leave behind lingering horror, this echoes through generations of horror stories, all the way from Pet Sematary to The Ring. Now let's talk about something truly terrifying. The Mesopotamian afterlife. In their mythology, when you died, you didn't ascend to paradise or burn in a fiery hell. Instead, you went to Kor, a place of eternal darkness and despair. Imagine being trapped underground forever, your body rotting away as your soul is left to wander, starving, forgotten, feeding only on dust. The name itself is a mystery. It can mean mountain or foreign land, or something even more sinister, the underworld. To the Sumerians, Kor was a great abyss, the place where the dead went, never to return, a land of silence, a place of dust and shadows. And yet some say Kor was actually more than a place. Some say it was alive. In Mesopotamian mythology, the underworld wasn't a place of fire and torment, nor was it a paradise. It was bleak, lifeless, a cold realm where the dead wandered as pale shadows, drinking dust and waiting for eternity to pass. The queen of this realm was eerie, the dark sister of the goddess Inanna, and once you entered her domain, you never left. The goddess Inanna, queen of the heavens, descended into Kor, seeking to claim its throne. But the underworld doesn't forgive arrogance. Inanna was stripped of her power, her body left to rot on a meat hook. Only the intervention of the gods brought her back to the world of the living. But even then, a price still had to be paid. Kor was more than just a place. It was a force, an ancient being of chaos, older than the gods themselves. Some stories say it was a great dragon lurking beneath the earth, waiting to rise. Others claim it was a monstrous abyss, swallowing all who dared to approach. What is it about the unknown that terrifies us? The dark corners of the earth, the depths of the ocean, the endless void beyond the stars. Maybe it's because we know that something waits there, something vast, something patient. To the ancients, Kor was the name for that fear. The abyss beneath the world, the place of no return. And maybe, just maybe, it still lingers. Beneath the ground we walk, beneath the reality we know, a forgotten god, just waiting, hungry for more souls. This vision of the afterlife is one of the earliest examples of existential horror, the fear that nothing awaits us but suffering and decay. It's an idea that's lived on in horror films for centuries. Look at The Others, where lost souls wander without knowing they're dead, or even Hereditary, which leans into that inescapable grip of fate and doom. Mesopotamian horror was never just about monsters. It was about helplessness, and that's what makes it so enduring. And besides monsters, of course, what's horror without demons? And if you thought demons were a Christian invention, well, think again. One of the most infamous demons of all time, Pazuzu, the one that possessed Regan in The Exorcist, was lifted straight from Mesopotamian mythology. Pazuzu was a terrifying entity with a grotesque face, taloned hands, and wings that could spread pestilence. But here's the twist. Pazuzu wasn't pure evil. In Mesopotamian lore, he was also invoked to ward off other worse spirits, a demon that could protect, even as he terrorized. This ambiguity is something modern horror still plays with. Think about The Witch from 2015, where the demonic force may not be entirely malevolent, or even Hannibal Lecter, a monster, yes, but strangely charismatic, even protective in his own twisted way. And then there are the curses. Mesopotamians believed words had power. Curses weren't just words, they were living forces that could haunt generations. That idea has bled into countless horror films, whether it's the cursed videotape in The Ring, or the Necronomicon in The Evil Dead, or even the sinister promise in Drag Me to Hell. Horror thrives on the idea that some things once spoken can never be undone. So you may be asking now, why does this matter? Why are stories from 4,000 years ago still haunting us today? It's because horror is universal. The fears of the Mesopotamians, that fear of death, the unknown, things lurking in the darkness, these are all the same fears that drive horror today. From Humbaba to Pazuzu, from cursed tablets to the desolate underworld, the DNA of horror was written in clay tablets long before it ever graced the silver screen. The next time you watch The Exorcist, or maybe even find yourself shivering at a horror story that hints at an ancient, unknowable evil, just remember, you're feeling the same fear that our ancestors felt millennia ago. Horror is timeless, and it always comes back. Now it's time to go somewhere steeped in death, mystery, and supernatural, we're going to head over to the land of pharaohs, pyramids, and gods of the dead. Egyptian mythology is filled with tons of eerie tales of resurrection, curses, and the afterlife. Stories that have shaped horror in ways you might not even realize. From the grotesque tale of Osiris to the legendary curse of the pharaohs, these myths are the ancestors of many of the horror tropes that we see today in books, movies, and even pop culture. Now, before we get into the terrifying myths themselves, let's talk about how central death and the afterlife were to ancient Egyptian culture. While we tend to think of death as something final, the Egyptians saw it as just another step, a doorway leading into another existence. They believed that what happened after death wasn't just a matter of fate. It depended on how you lived your life. The journey into the afterlife was perilous, filled with trials, judgment, and the possibility of eternal doom. This belief system created an entire culture obsessed with the preservation of the dead. Mummification wasn't just a creepy ritual. It was a necessity, a way of ensuring that a person's soul could reunite with the body and continue its journey. Now let's talk about one of the most famous and disturbing myths in Egyptian mythology, the story of Osiris. Osiris was the god of the dead, but he wasn't always a ruler of the underworld. He started out as a king. He was beloved and just until his jealous brother Set betrayed him in one of the most gruesome murders in mythology. Set didn't just kill Osiris, he dismembered him. He cut his body into a bunch of pieces and scattered them all across Egypt. Imagine the horror of that. A powerful ruler, torn apart, his body desecrated beyond recognition. This isn't just a tragic story. It's the kind of visceral body horror that we see in films like Hellraiser or even Saw. But the story doesn't end there. Osiris's wife, Isis, didn't accept his fate. She went on a desperate quest to find all of his body parts across Egypt and piece him back together. He ended up becoming some kind of supernatural Frankenstein monster. And using powerful magic, Osiris brought him back to life, but not as he was before. Osiris could no longer live among the living. He was resurrected as the ruler of the underworld, forever bound to the realm of the dead. That's where horror finds its true root in this myth. Resurrection is rarely a clean or comforting thing in horror. When something or someone comes back from the dead, they're never quite the same. Look at Pet Sematary, when the dead return, but with something deeply wrong with them. Even in zombie films, the horror comes not just from the walking corpses, but from the unnaturalness of it, the eerie fact that they should be dead, but they aren't. Now let's talk about one of the most infamous legends to come out of Egypt, the mummy's curse. We've all seen it in movies. Archaeologists disturb an ancient tomb only to unleash an ancient vengeful force that was never meant to be awoken. This idea is so embedded in horror that it's easy to forget where it came from. The concept of the mummy's curse really took off in the early 20th century with the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922. Not long after the tomb was opened, several members of the excavation team died under mysterious circumstances. Rumors spread that an ancient curse had been unleashed upon them. In reality, many of these deaths actually had logical explanations, some from infections, others from illness, but that didn't stop the public from believing in the idea of the pharaoh's wrath. The press ran with the story, feeding the idea that ancient tombs were dangerous places meant to be left undisturbed. From there, the horror genre took the idea and ran with it. The 1932 film The Mummy, starring Boris Karloff, first introduced audiences to Imhotep, an undead priest resurrected by an ancient spell. Unlike the slow-moving, bandaged mummies of later movies, this version of the mummy was intelligent, cunning, and terrifying in his pursuit of revenge. Even today, the mummy remains a horror icon, evolving with each new interpretation, from the 1999 film The Mummy starring Brendan Fraser to the darker 2017 version featuring Tom Cruise. The fear of something ancient, something that should have remained buried, continues to haunt us. So we've talked about these myths and their influence on horror stories about resurrection and curses, But Egyptian mythology has influenced the horror genre in so many other ways as well. One of them is the fear of immortality. Osiris's resurrection and the mummy's eternal state tie in to one of horror's greatest fears. What if we could never die? Immortality seems like a dream, but horror often turns it into a nightmare. Think about vampires, who live forever but at the cost of their humanity. Egyptian mythology planted the seeds for that idea centuries ago. There's also the divine judgment in the afterlife. The idea that your soul could be judged after death is terrifying. The ancient Egyptians believed that if your heart was heavier than the feather of a moth, you'd be devoured by a monstrous creature. This idea of cosmic justice appears in movies like Drag Me to Hell, where supernatural forces weigh the worth of a person's soul. Now, there's also ancient evil that should remain undisturbed. How many horror movies start with a forbidden place being opened? From The Exorcist to The Evil Dead, the idea of unleashing something ancient and cursed comes directly from those myths about Egyptian tombs and lost relics. It's that fear of messing with things that should stay buried that really keeps us up at night. So what is it about Egyptian mythology that still terrifies us today? Is it the fear of disturbing something that should remain undisturbed? The idea that the dead can rise again? Or maybe it's the terrifying thought that death might not be the end, but just the beginning of something worse. What's clear is that horror owes a lot to these ancient myths. From undead creatures to divine retribution, the echoes of Egypt's myths can be seen in countless horror movies, horror books, and even video games. Now, if this episode sent a chill down your spine, make sure to subscribe to Cabin of Horrors for more deep dives into the history of fear. And if you have a favorite horror story inspired by ancient Egypt, hit me up on social media or even in the comments of this podcast. I'd love to hear about it. Until next time, remember, some things are meant to stay buried.